Perfect, Marcus. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm a PE CFO. I've been predominantly around healthcare for the better part of 20 years now. Done a number of exits, done a number of big acquisitions, kissed a number of frogs along the way.
As you do.
As you do. And yeah, just culminating in Elysium, which was a 775 million exit back in the last year. So pretty good deal. We exited that into trade to Ramsay Healthcare. An interesting exit process, but a great deal, and one that I think all stakeholders were pretty pleased with.
Excellent. And you mentioned about kissing a few frogs. I won't go into too much detail, that would be unfair to do so. But you know, when you entered into this, I mean, I remember we had that first conversation. I think you were saying you were at the rugby at the time as well, and it was all around an interim premise. Is there any nervousness around the idea of doing an interim gig versus a permanent one from the offset?
Not really. So I decided to go interim as a conscious decision. I'm not an interim, I'm not a serial interim, and I know many people are, and I think it's a great career path, but it's not really what I do. I think for me, it's more about going into businesses, adding the value, looking towards the exit, getting the business ready for that exit, and then taking them through that process. In an ideal world, you stay with the business and you continue, you roll, you move on. But in other worlds, you look for other opportunities. But as you do that, you will often join a business, you'll be onto a particular path, you'll be working alongside the PE house, but for a range of reasons, excuse me, it doesn't always work in the way that you'd hope that it would. And the previous role that I'd been in, the notice period was pretty long. I was on 12-month notice period. Wow. So the trouble with that was that as I was looking to move on, because I could see there was no exit on the horizon anytime soon, really the challenge was finding the right gig, but getting them to wait for 12 months was going to be nigh on impossible. So I had to exit the role into the interim market, have the confidence to know that you go in, you know your wares, you know what you're doing, and then move on into a permanent role with the equity and all of the benefits attached to it. And that was the game. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It was a bit of a chance because I didn't want to get into serial interiming, but at the same time, I was also confident that once people, once I was in the business long enough, I could have, step up into that permanent role, which is what I did.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? You mentioned about the 12 month, and that's basically a quarter of a business's hold. In essence, the first 12 months of an investment, that's where everything's go.
Yeah.
But yeah, so look, I mean, we had the conversation, started as an interim, as you say. Did you at any point in the first sort of weeks, months, think or feel it was going to be a permanent thing? Because we never really spoke about it that much. We sort of just, as I seem to recall, it was very much here for 6 months, support the business, a bit of a see what happens scenario.
Yeah. I was pretty confident early on. I knew the business and I knew many people in the business, so we crossed paths doing various different things. I led the acquisition of BMI Healthcare back in 2006, and the precursor to Elysium was Partnerships in Care. That had been spun off out of BMI the year before that in 2005. So I'd crossed paths with many people in the senior management team. So when I joined, it kind of felt a lot like coming home. It was the same business that I'd been in 10 years previous. The systems were the same, which again, there's good and bad with that, but there was a sense of familiarity. So for me, very early on, I remember having a conversation with the chief exec, probably in the second week, and she said, look, you're a perfect fit. I can see that within a short period of time, and I felt the same way. And you just felt that natural connection. It was also helpful that I was so familiar with the industry, but equally with the way that the business operated in terms of its thinking and systems, because I was able to then start to make an impactful change fairly early on, and that in turn made me I think part of the team really quickly. So I never really got that sense that I was treated as an interim. It was more a case of, well, we're going to test you out a bit as you would, but very early on, you're part of the team. You're in this journey with us, and let's talk about the future. Let's think that through.
But you had to make some big calls early on as well.
Yeah. It's always the same thing though, and I think that's right. It's always about the people. You know this. It's of course it's what you do. the people and the dynamic and getting the right people doing the right things at the right times, I think, is what makes magic in any team.
Yeah,
And what I'd inherited was quite disparate. So second day, I was getting rid of the procurement director because he wasn't going to be part of that team. The entire senior finance team, really, with one exception, I ended up flipping them all out. I took over IT and IM, and again, all of senior management then needed to be moved on, not because they weren't mine, but largely because they'd become ingrained in a particular culture and process that wasn't going to align with what I needed, and they couldn't move as fast as I needed them to move. So yeah, it was pretty fast moving early on, but again, I think that's the value of being in an industry where you know it well, you know what good looks like, and you can get there fairly fast.
that was one of the prerequisites when supporting the business in the first place. I remember I had a conversation with the chair and obviously both Joy and then Gareth, the HRD, as well, and it was very much around, we need someone who gets this space because we need someone to be able to make an impact because it hadn't worked out previously than the prior person. And with that, so you come in, made some big calls early on as well. Do you feel, you talk about pace as well, is that largely driven by the business? Was that because BC Partners were trying to drive the pace and the agenda as well? Because there's always a time frame, it's probably going to be a two-year hold in terms of what they wanted to go and do something, some sort of activity. But what do you think drove that pace?
I think a lot of it is innate. I kind of believe in the world of private equity, you've got to be moving at pace. It's a very different pace and it's a very different tempo to what you'd see in big corporate. And I've worked in both. Equally, it's probably even a different pace to being in really small SMEs. Yeah. And I've done the startup in the past before. And people would think that that's super pace. But actually, if you find the right sweet spot in private equity, I find that that's where it's all about the foresight of what you're moving towards. Yes. And the speed by which you can get there. That's what drives value. Because everyone can move towards an ultimate endpoint, but if you take too long, you never reach it, or you reach it at a point where management's destroyed equity value, or the PE house, through their own pick and interest value accretion, begins to eat into what should be a good symbiotic relationship. I would say that it's massively important to identify what good looks like early on. That's
I hear that phrase all the time.
Yeah. Well, it's important to set out the target, and people use a number of phrases for it. It's really about identifying at the end of a period of time, what is it that we're hoping to achieve, and therefore how can we measure ourselves against that particular target. And that's what I mean by specifying what good looks like. How are we going to do it, and what length of time are we going to give ourselves in order to achieve it. Once you have that clarity of vision, then you can really wrap your arms around everyone and you can take them along with you on that journey. And I felt that was somewhat lacking. Yep. And in order to achieve that, you go through the people process, get the right team in. Yep. And then equally, you share the vision of how quickly you want to achieve the desired objective. Push too hard, run too hard, and you're going to alienate those around you. Run too slowly, and you're going to either destroy your value or shareholder value, or equally, you're simply not going to be as effective as what you need to be. So it's around finding the right tempo for the business.
With that in mind, something which I'm talking about a lot with many PE houses around that sort of succession piece. And you're talking, what I get from what you say is it almost comes with experience, knowing when to push, when to pull. What advice would you therefore give to somebody who is going into a first CFO role? It's private equity backed. Yes, they've probably been the group controller or something of similar ilk previous. They may have done some of the external sort of banking arrangements. They may have had some exposure to PE. But what advice would you give to ensure they can be a success as a first-time CFO then?
Great question, $1 million question, I think, and many books been written on this. But I think for me, it comes down to looking forward. And I think the big change in finance, in particular, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, has really been towards converting data into information.
Yeah.
So If we look back 15, 20 years, the principal source of data that was readily available in most businesses, or even 30, 40 years ago, was financial information. So it's natural that finance is the custodian of that information. However, the majority of that financial information was always backwards looking. So how did we do last week, last month, last year? The reality is you need to convert how we did do to how we are doing, and even better, how we're going to do based on a series of particular actions.
Yes.
And that's what you need to be thinking about. So in a financial controllership role, even to an extent in an FP&A role, you're taking historic information and you're trying to convert that really into something that's meaningful today.
Yeah.
I think in the CFO piece, it's about looking at not just financial information, but all manner of information, all manner of KPIs, all manner of data that exists readily in most businesses, that plethora of data, and converting it into information.
Yeah.
And converting it into a call to arms, converting it into something that is so simple that anyone can look at it, and without seeing a spreadsheet of numbers with their eyes roll back in their heads, they get a simple call to arms. This is what I need to do to better influence the business.
Makes sense.
It's a mindset. It's a mindset change. It's about thinking forward and getting all of the information, financial and otherwise, in a readily absorbable form. And that for me would be the number one thing. How do we achieve that? People and vision. So you've got to be looking forward. The analogy I give is, the best runners in the world aren't spending their time looking at their feet as they run. If they do, they're going to run into lampposts. They're going to run into cul-de-sacs. The best runners in the world are looking forward so they can see what the horizon looks like. They can see when they need to up the pace for a hill, or they can pull it off a little bit for a downhill. But if you keep looking at your feet, you can be guaranteed you won't trip, but you can also be guaranteed you're going to make some really big mistakes because you aren't going to see the challenges coming. So it's about that vision. And once you've got the vision, you understand that you're a support role. You're giving the business the information that it needs to better run the business. You then bring your team around you. Yeah. And you ask yourself the question, do you have the right people to do those things? But setting out the vision for what it is you want to achieve. You then bring in the right people around you. And that, for me, is the symbiotic relationship and the approach by which we work with teams, yeah, and you build a successful CFO role. I think.
That makes sense. And talking about, perfect segue really into some of the support we offered as well during your tenure, but talk about sort of bringing in the right people. I know we did a couple of bits as well to support you along. I think it was a CIO and a property director, if I recall correctly.
That's right.
How do those processes go? What are your thoughts on those to put you on the spot?
Yeah, they were great. So the CIO role was a replacement for somebody that I'd brought in. So early on in my tenure, I took IT. It naturally fed into a finance function, not because I'm the most techie guy, but because it was fundamental to the provision of that information that I was talking about. Information management in particular is a big part of the IT infrastructure, particularly within Elysium. I brought in a new CIO, and he'd been in place for a period of time. The reality is that the previous incumbent didn't have the right tempo for what we needed in that business. I think every business, and it's not to say that he wasn't technically competent or that he wasn't a good leader or manager, he was all those things. But you go back to being able to move at speed, he wasn't able to move at the speed that the business needed. So again, make a decision, make it decisively, don't prevaricate. There are very few instances in my career where I've looked at someone and thought, I really need to move them out of that role, and 6 months later have thought, I'm really glad I didn't. In fact, that's never happened. So once you get to that point, the best thing you can do is to move them on from that role, and we did that. Treat them well, treat people humanly. It's incredibly important. We're just humans. We're just in different roles. You can be, I'm quite keen on saying I can be more senior in a professional capacity, but I can never be more senior in a human capacity. So always treat people like humans first and show those values. But professionally, you can make the right decisions for the business, and that's what we did. We removed them from the business. I engaged yourselves. I've had a relationship with Eton Bridge going back a number of years now. I think I was first introduced to Eton Bridge, must be at least 10 years ago, and we've had multiple interactions. And it was a great process. So it was everything that I would expect of executive search. I was given a great shortlist. And frankly, I could have taken anyone. I think 6 on the shortlist. Any one of them would have been a competent candidate. As it turned out, I'm delighted with the CTO, CIO that I did recruit, and he really has been a breath of fresh air. We've had challenges in our IT infrastructure. A large portion of it has been because there simply hasn't been the foresight that I was talking about earlier, where people were looking forward to the obstacles and the challenges that were coming. They were dealing with the issues right now and watching their feet, not realizing that they were going to go out of contract or beyond service on various different software initiatives and what have you. And that's caused us some significant challenges. Again, most of that we're now through, so that's been a good result. Equally, on the property director front, was a new role for us. We've got a significant property portfolio. We've got 75 different hospitals, some of them 150 beds plus. So they're fairly significant, valued at well over $500 million. And we'd been managing our property in an ad hoc way. We had some regional people working with the ops directors. I wouldn't say it was a hobby, but it certainly wasn't a specific targeted purpose. And that's what we needed. We needed to bring in a property director to do that. And we did. We had an excellent search with you, same kind of process. And we really found a plethora of different types of property directors, as you would do with CTOs and indeed CFOs. There certainly isn't one size fits all. People come with different skills, attributes, and those skills and attributes are right, in my view, for different businesses at different times. And again, I would also say that in most businesses, every river runs its course. And what was right 10 years ago may not be what's right today. Some people can change with the business, but often that doesn't happen. So we saw a great, a diverse range of directors in those particular roles. And we've made 2 excellent appointments. So really pleased with you for that.
It's encouraging to hear.
You'd know if it wasn't.
Well, yeah, I know I would. You wouldn't hold back. And one of the key themes you keep talking about is relationships, and pace as well, of course, but relationships. And as much as those people had important relationships with you, your relationships with the CEO, chair, and PE were obviously critical too. How do you, I guess almost to rewind it, how do you go about assessing those before you go into a role? And then how do you continue to enhance them whilst you're in post? Because they can so easily break down, and we've seen it many times.
Yeah, they can. It's really challenging. I've been into a number of roles where, despite my best efforts and diligence, looking at the business plans, talking to the execs, chief exec, to the equity sponsors, the chairmans, what you can often find is that the trajectory of the business has such a tremendous impact on the stresses of those particular relationships that it's really difficult to call it. I think that from a personal perspective, most people I've worked with in an executive context, you get to the top by being a reasonable person that you can work with. A couple of exceptions, a few crazy people along the way, but generally people that are engaging and that you can work with. Yeah. What begins to put overt levels of stress on that is typically 2 things in my experience. One is a divergence of interests, which leads to political interplay. That gets pretty challenging. The interview process should illustrate and highlight a lot of that. If you're getting different messages from different parties as you go through the interview process, talking to the equity sponsor versus the chair and the chief exec, if you get different answers to the same questions, you probably have divergent interests, and that's a bit of a red flag. The other, and this sounds so simple, is businesses that perform and that do well and that achieve the targets that you've set out generally have better working environments than businesses that are under stress and under pressure. So there's a couple of key points in this. One is set out the right and appropriate targets, and then make sure that you hit those targets. If the targets are too lofty and you miss them, even though the performance might be exceptional, there will be an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. If you set out the targets too low, well, then from the get-go, nobody's particularly satisfied, and you break a little bit of trust because people believe that you've set them a little bit too achievable. So set the right targets, set the right plan, agree that plan up front, and then deliver those objectives. And if you can do that, that goes a long way towards settling down the equity sponsor, but equally giving or creating an atmosphere of trust with both the chief exec and with the chairman. Ideally, you want to get to a point, certainly in a CFO capacity, where if it's financially related, chief exec's not really getting involved, and certainly the chair isn't getting much involved. If there's a finance question or there's finance leadership or finance insight, it's coming from the CFO's desk, where those roles begin to shall we say, interfere or become overly involved in the finance function. That's where things can begin to break down. And generally, that only happens because business performance isn't happening in the way that it should do. So in the interview process, I would say it's asking the same questions of all three parties and ensuring that they're all aligned in terms of their perception of how the business is performing and indeed what the strategy is.
I know something we've done as well. We've often encouraged people to talk to other businesses backed by particular PE houses as well, especially when they've been distressed, to understand how they actually behaved. I think that can also be quite helpful. So look, talk me a bit through, you joined the business, made changes, aligned with the individuals you're working with, going for growth. Talk me a bit through that sort of growth period prior to the exit program.
Yeah, so joined the business, and growth was good, but it was typically revolved around M&A. The majority of the growth that we saw wasn't organic. It was fairly successful buy and build, although we weren't doing much on the build front. And the trouble with that in an Elysium context was that we were paying multiples that didn't leave very much arbitrage from an ultimate exit perspective. So there was some value there, but it wasn't going to be delivering the value that we should be as an acquisitive or as a platform for growth. So very early on in the proposition, we said, look, the cash and the equity isn't going to come through. If we continue to take additional equity checks, that's going to destroy management value. We don't want to do that. We'll just see dilution. What we'd rather do is move and convert the cash that we are generating into a series of developments. If we do the right developments, working hand in glove in what we do with the NHS, which is our business partner, we can, as I like to say, fix the NHS's problems. So we've got, well, indeed.
We'll leave that.
Indeed. That's probably a topic for another day. But we can fix their problems in that they have CapEx constraints. They aren't always able to build the facilities that they want within the timescale that they need them, whereas we can be more nimble. So using that natural advantage, we started to move away from acquisitions, which by definition don't add capacity to the system. They just change the ownership from party A to party B. We're now adding beds back into the system. And that's what we started to do. So we spent fairly aggressively on that. Not only were the financial returns better, the significantly better. So we would buy on, let's say, 8x, which is the equivalent to around 12.5% a return on capital on an annual basis. We would now be building on, let's say, 3 to 4x. So we're now getting a 33 or 25% return on that capital. The difference between that and our ultimate exit point is generating value for the business. But we were only able to do that because we built a very successful portfolio initially. We now then convert that strategy. So I was very much a part of making that conscious decision to move away from acquisitions into development to get the best bang for buck. But part of that was also about demonstrating to ultimate purchasers that this could continue and we could see that growth out over the next 5, 7, 10 years, as the case may be. and building up that business plan, something that is comprehensive enough that any party, as part of a diligence process, understands the business very simply. So we spent an inordinate amount of time building up what is a very complicated and very detailed business plan, and then paring it right the way back to something that is simple and easily understandable. Yes. Because in an exit process, complexity destroys values. Complexity leads to risk. Yep. Leads to the perception or the reality that you don't understand what it is that you're buying into. So we had to build up a business plan that was really simple, that anyone could understand, and that demonstrated that the growth trajectory of the business could continue in over that medium to longer term. That was really the focus, and in order to do that, that's the ultimate end game. We then pare that back. You need the right people, and you need to move within that timescale to get to that point. So for me, the value is really about being able to convert a vision into something on paper that will stand up to the scrutiny of diligence. That then delivers and drives value. And when a bidder asks, well, how do I believe this? How do I trust it? The answer is because I've been delivering it for the last 3 years. Everything we've delivered historically is in line with what I'm saying we're going to deliver going forward, and that we've been able to deliver and achieve that budget or that plan every single month throughout my tenure. And I think that was a strong selling point in the final exit process.
No, massively. And is there anything you'd change or do differently? I know it's been successful, so it's sometimes quite hard to sort of reflect in that sense, but is there anything you'd have done differently during that period under BC Partners?
I think it's hard to say that I'd do anything differently, because ultimately, as you say, we had a very successful exit. All parties were happy. I think that Ramsay, being the new shareholders, they're pleased with what they've bought because they really have got a great business. I think as ever, there's always opportunity to have moved faster, where you have that moment of reticence where you think, am I going too fast? Am I able to bring everyone along with me? There is often a time where you think, I need to slow this down because people are beginning to wobble. The reality is people can do far more than they think and that they know they can do. And there were times, I think in hindsight, where I could have pushed a bit harder and I could have moved it a bit faster. Would that have led to a better outcome? It's hard to say. I'd say probably not. I think the outcome was pretty good. But there were times where I probably slowed down to an extent where I needn't have, where I could have continued that conviction and we could have made things happen a little bit better. In terms of the relationships with the balance of the board, I was really fortunate. We had an incredible chair, hugely experienced and very affable character, somebody that I would happily work with again. BC Partners were unbelievable as an equity sponsor, and as I say, I've worked with a number. They were by far the best that I've worked with in my career. Very supportive, gave the reins to management, gave the challenge where we required it, where it was helpful, but ultimately we're always there to support management in driving that business value. And then again, chief exec who knows the industry intimately, been in it for 25 years. There's very little or anything in mental health that she could ever learn. In fact, I'd say there's nothing of any value. So that was really incredibly powerful, and bringing that all together, where commercially, financially, I was given the reins, the right equity sponsor, the right chair to support but challenge, and then the industry expertise really created a very powerful dynamic and team. So it's hard to look back on that and say that there are any particular regrets. I think it was a good deal, and it was a good moment in the history of Elysium.
Well, what on you in the business. And something else I'm always interested to understand is, you mentioned at the start, 20 years in the industry, CFOs multiple times in PE, done exits, done integration and acquisitions. Have you ever had mentors during your time? Have you ever looked up to try and emulate people? Has there ever been that for you?
I think, the answer is naturally yes. I think you get some people who are very good at learning from a book. They read a quote, or they read up on Steve Jobs and they say, right, well, that's what he's done. I'm going to emulate that. And some people are great at doing that. I'm a little bit less so. I enjoy reading autobiographies and some business books, but I learn from people. I learn from what I see. I learn from engagements, and I've learned and I've taught myself to be far more observant as I've continued throughout my career. By being observant of people around you, the benefit that you have is that you can learn from all sorts of places. It's not only going to be one business book, but it could be that you learn from a junior in your team because you see an interaction or a dynamic and you think, wow, that was really powerful. That was clever. That was smart. That was very well played. Being able to absorb all of those interactions from everyone around you, I think, is probably more attuned to the way that I think and the way that I behave. Yeah. So have I had mentors? Absolutely. Have I worked for some great CFOs? Yes. But I've learned as much from the great ones as I have from the not so great ones. In that you look at interaction, you think, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be that. I don't want to emulate that. Which I think is a little bit more difficult to do from a book because you look at the good stuff and you get a little bit less of the not so good stuff. I think that as you develop in your career, being self-reflective is a massively important attribute. And I know that I've learned far more from getting things wrong than I ever have from getting things right. When you get things right, you keep doing them. When you get them wrong, it causes you to pause and reflect. It causes you to adapt. It causes you to think, well, that wasn't as effective as I wanted it to be. And by getting those things wrong, you then learn by a natural process to do things that are more effective, and that's what helps you to progress. But I've been very fortunate. I have worked with some incredibly talented people. I don't want to name anyone, but some really clever, smart people. No one that I've met or worked with that I've thought, I just want to be you. But certainly a great many people who I've met and I've thought that part of what you do I just think is fantastic, and I'm going to do my best to emulate it. I'm going to mine you to find out how you do it and how you see the world that way, so that I can begin to take that on board. And I think that's one of the beauties of working in private equity, is that in my experience, PE houses, the sponsors themselves, are typically incredibly smart people, which I enjoy. But they're not always the best at getting things done. They're not always the best people managers. Super smart, but not always great managers. In the portfolio companies themselves, again, you can find excellent managers, really great people, leaders, but they aren't always at the same cerebral level as what you'd find in the PE house. But mash that all together, and I think you've got a plethora of opportunity to learn and draw down from, which is ideally what I like to try and do.
Well, look, I'm just really pleased. It's been a real journey.
Thank you.
But Keith, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Marcus, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. To listen to more of our conversations with senior leaders, please do subscribe to Eton Bridge Podcast on Spotify or Apple, and the full interviews are available on YouTube.